Hello, and welcome to Now Where Were We? A series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. Your host for this program is Deborah Ross. In this series, Deb takes us to locations that inform us about the history of our community. She also visits with local historians. We welcome your feedback and suggestions.
Hello, and welcome to Now Where Were We, an ongoing series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. I'm Deborah Ross. This is the fourth in our series that I've been calling By the Decades. Each episode is featuring a different decade in our area's history, and we're up to the 1870s. I'm standing on the tracks that run alongside the Deschutes Parkway in West Olympia, with Capitol Lake and the city of Olympia behind me. And on this location was the Narrow Gauge Railroad that brought rail traffic 15 miles from Tenino to Olympia and saved our city as the capital of Washington Territory, and indeed its important role in the commercial, industrial, and political life of our early territory. In 1925, about 50 years after the railroad was built, prominent citizen Winlock Miller wrote an article about the Narrow Gauge Railroad that he published in an historical journal. And today we're going to feature the words of Winlock Miller in talking about how the Narrow Gauge Railroad came to be and how it exemplified the indomitable spirit of Olympia's citizens. Let's listen to Winlock Miller's words as narrated by Panorama resident Dave Newton.
For a period of 5 years, from 1869 to 1874, the most exciting public question in every town on the eastern shore of Puget Sound was the location of the terminus and branch lines of the Northern Pacific Railroad, which was then nearing completion. Rivalry was intense for these favors, as the town that first secured the terminus was assured of a commercial future. Olympia, as the capital of the state and the oldest town of importance on Puget Sound, was at first considered to have the best claim to the Northern Pacific terminus. Conditions had reached a point where the Northern Pacific, by extending or denying railway privileges, could determine the fate of a community. The Northern Pacific officials, following their not too scrupulous plan of playing one town off against the others, had secured from Tacoma the promise of a larger grant of land than Olympia could possibly give. As a result, it was reasonably certain by the fall of 1872 that Tacoma would become the terminus. With the announcement, vanished the last vestiges of any hope that Olympia would be the commercial center of western Washington. The Northern Pacific made no move to extend to Olympia their branch line, which ran through Tenino. Without any rail connections, Olympia was faced with commercial annihilation. It was apparent that a railroad must be built to connect with this line at its nearest point, Tenino. On December 31st, the organization known as the Olympia Railroad Union was organized. On January 8, 1873, the Articles of Incorporation were drawn up and a capitalization of $200,000 announced. $200,000 was an ambitious sum for a town of less than 2,000 people to raise locally. It was the intention of the union not to seek outside aid. It was provided, however, that the stock in $100 shares could be bought with land, goods, articles of value, or even labor on the roadbed. An interesting insight into the pioneer financial condition of the territory. Public interest was soon aroused, and in only a few weeks, 1,500 acres of land had been subscribed. The situation of Olympia, the farthest corner of an undeveloped territory with little or no surplus capital, would have ended the project, except for the determination of the citizens to carry it through. It is safe to assume that a town of equal size today, even with modern financial aids, could not survey and build a railroad. Olympia accepted the plan as entirely feasible, and the union began to consider actual construction work. Within a week, the railroad union had launched a campaign to interest everyone in Thurston County in the railroad. It became the leading subject for discussion in Olympia. Lands and some money were pledged. Those who had neither lands nor money promised to work on the roadbed for a specified time. Several merchants subscribed to stock by giving provisions for the workmen and material for the construction work. One man donated the use of his pile driver as his share. At a meeting held on March 7th, the ladies agreed to send their Chinese servants to work on the road. Active work began on April 7th, and the first few miles of grading were done by the businessmen of Olympia and farmers from the county. Miss Mary O'Neill, an early resident of Olympia, describes in the following paragraphs the opening of the work.
The road from Olympia across Bush Prairie was graded by citizens of the county turning out in a body and working on the right-of-way. On these field days, all business was suspended. The people assembled early in the morning on Main Street, headed by the band, and Charlie Granger's big mule with a cannon strapped on his back, marched out to the right-of-way, every man armed with a pick and shovel. Governor Ferry and other officials marched and worked with the others. The ladies always prepared a bountiful dinner at noon. Some days there were perhaps 700 or 800 men at work, and as much as a half-mile of right-of-way was graded. Farmers with their teams, plows, and scrapers came from all parts of the county and lent a hand.
This is a scene from pioneer life that deserves to be remembered for its picturesqueness. The beginning of construction gave an added impetus to the raising of funds. The most important part of the grading was completed in the season of 1874 before the funds of the Union were exhausted. The people of Olympia had reached their financial limit, and nothing more could be expected from them. The roadbed stayed unfinished for 3 years. But in June 1877, local merchant E.N. Ouimet called a meeting to form a new organization. The Thurston County Railroad Construction Company was organized, capitalized at $250,000 in $1 shares. $5,150 in cash was subscribed the first day. Volunteer labor was again called for, and 150 men worked on the grading at Tumwater. By May 10th, the bonds were ready for issue, and on this date a steamer brought the spikes for the trestle work and ties. The locomotive and rails came in a week's time. The locomotive, of course, was shipped from the east, while the rails were re-rolled from the original Central Pacific rails at San Francisco. The cars were built by Ward and Mitchell at Tumwater. The instant the rails arrived, they were hurried to the roadbed and 60 feet of track laid, on which a small flat car was placed. The track laying was pushed so that on July 25th, the date for completion was set as August 1st. 2 trains a day were scheduled to leave Olympia. Appended to the announcement were the passenger and freight rates for the road. From Olympia to Tumwater, the fare was 12.5 cents. To Bush Station, 50 cents. To Spurlock, 75 cents. To Tenino, $1. Ordinary freight was $1 a ton, bulky things such as hay, $2. On August 1st, the road was formally opened. The entire rolling stock of the road, the locomotive, 1 passenger car, 1 box car, and 3 flat cars carried 350 Olympia people to Tenino, the running time being an hour and a half for 15 miles. A prominent citizen opposed to the railroad rode in front of the train on his horse to demonstrate the uselessness of modern transportation. The road that Olympia had waited for so long was at last completed. The Olympia-Tenino Railroad, while it did not bring great commercial prosperity to Olympia, did save the city from sinking into decay. Also, it gave Thurston County and the surrounding territory the desired railroad communication with the rest of the territory. Most important, however, it placed a period at the end of the paragraph of pioneer railroad building. The Olympia and Tenino Railroad, while not the most important of these roads, deserves to be remembered as the most typical example of the pioneer initiative and self-reliance which made their construction possible.